today. So we've got a wonderful session in store for you this afternoon, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am coming to you from Epiquet in Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. As we are gathering today on a virtual platform, it is important to respectfully acknowledge the history, spirituality, culture, and rights of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples from coast to coast to coast, who have called this land home since time immemorial and who continue to experience the ongoing effects of colonialism and systemic racism. And I encourage everyone to consider how we can each, in our own way, actively honor and uphold our treaty obligations in a spirit of true reconciliation. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Institute of Island Studies, we're a research, education, and public policy institute based at the University of Prince Edward Island, Canada. You can learn more about what we do by checking out our website, which is islandstudies.com, or our social media accounts, which Maggie has just popped in the chat. The Institute of Island Studies has been hosting the Island Lecture Series in a few different formats for almost 3 decades now. We're excited to be able to offer our events on a virtual platform this year because it means that you can join us from all over the world or just down the road from the comfort and safety of your own homes. At this point, we usually send around our newsletter sign-up sheet that goes around the room and gets filled up with names and email addresses, but things are a bit different this year now that we have gone virtual. So if you'd like to sign up for our monthly newsletter, please feel free to pop your email in the chat or send it to us directly. No spam, we promise, nor will we sell our list to anybody. If you're not comfortable sharing your email in Zoom, no worries. You can also subscribe directly, and Maggie has just popped that link into the chat. So with that, I'll now hand it over to our host today, Dr. Jim Randall, the UNESCO Chair in Island Studies and Sustainability here at the University of Prince Edward Island. Jim.
Thanks for that introduction, Laurie. It seems unusual to have that same spiel virtually when we normally do the tag team effort in person, but I am glad, as you are, that more people potentially can participate in this. It's my pleasure to be the moderator for the session and to introduce the 2 speakers over the next little while. But I wanted to spend a couple moments just before that to say a little bit about the project that actually allowed some of this research to take place. I have the fortune of being the principal investigator in a larger SSHRC grant. That's an acronym that stands for Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for those who aren't in Canada. And it was one of their partnership development grants over a 4-year period. The title of the grant was called Sustainable Island Futures, and it involves island experts and practitioners from 12 islands around the world, 6 of them that are small island states, and 6 that are subnational island jurisdictions, such as Prince Edward Island and at least part of Newfoundland and Labrador. And part of the objective of the purpose of this project was to see to a much sort of more focused extent how governance and government might make a difference in terms of the sustainability and sustainable development on the islands in the study. And particularly to see, since we had subnational island jurisdictions and also small island states, whether that makes any difference in terms of the perception of stakeholders in those jurisdictions. So it's fascinating to see this research coming to fruition, and this is just one of the outcomes of the research. So I'm glad to see Mark and Ásthildur and their teams bring this forward. Now I have the pleasure of introducing the 2 speakers, and I'll do it in no particular order. The first one I'll introduce is Dr. Ásthildur Bernharðsdóttir, and Ásthildur holds a PhD in political science. And I know I'm going to mangle this, but she also has a cand OECON, and that I understand, Ásthildur, if you don't correct me, that's equivalent to a master's in economics in business administration. She's an independent scholar at Reykjavik Academy in Iceland and a lecturer in crisis management at the University of Iceland. Ásthildur has studied risk reduction and response to avalanches, earthquakes, and ship strandings. She's led Icelandic research groups on crisis management in Iceland and has developed, along with Icelandic scholars in general, guidelines on long-term responses to natural disasters for local authorities. Our second speaker, although I believe he's going to be first, is Dr. Mark Stoddart. And Mark completed his PhD at the University of British Columbia in 2008. Interestingly, I didn't realize this until I saw his bio, but the title of Mark's thesis was Making Meaning Out of Mountains, Skiing the Environment and Ecopolitics. And I'm wondering how many times Mark had a chance to ski on the slopes and tried to pass that off as thesis research. He's held a Killam postdoctoral fellowship at Dalhousie University and has been working in the sociology department at Memorial University in Newfoundland since 2010, and he's currently a full professor at Memorial. Professor Stoddart's research, teaching, and student supervision orients around environmental sociology, social movements, communications and culture, and tourism and recreation. And he's currently a principal investigator on another SSHRC-funded project called the Oil Tourism Interface and Social Ecological Change in the North Atlantic. And with that as an introduction, I'm going to turn it over to the two speakers.
Hello, everyone. And thank you, Jim. Yes, Mark and we are going to present our study titled Financial Crisis and Sustainable Island Futures, Comparing Iceland and Newfoundland and Labrador. Next slide. Before going further, I want to give you the overview of our presentation. I am introducing the study along with the key takeaways and then the Iceland case. Mark will present the Newfoundland and Labrador case before discussing the conclusion. Next slide, yes. For Iceland, we look at the 2008 banking crisis and its aftermath, which was caught up in the global financial crisis. For Newfoundland and Labrador, we look at the controversy around the Muskrat Falls hydroelectric mega development, which is a core part of the still unfolding economic crisis in the subnational jurisdiction. Next slide, please. From our case study comparison, we take away three key lessons. The first lesson is that a political culture of anti-reflexivity enabled high-risk decision-making. In both cases, early warnings were raised by experts about the deregulation of the Icelandic banking system, as well as the necessity for the Muskrat Falls development. Second lesson is that as both crises became apparent and were acknowledged by decision makers, there were issues of transparency and communication, both internally and externally. Lastly, the third lesson shows that as these crises unfolded, political reflexivity about governance failures generally did not originate from government actors or agencies responsible for the oversight, that is responsible of the oversight of the banking sector or the Muskrat Falls project. Instead, political reflexivity emerged primarily as a reaction through public protest after the crises were apparent. And then to the financial crisis in Iceland. That crisis has drawn much scholarly attention for being the first and biggest casualty of the global financial crisis, but also for its speedy recovery. The Icelandic banking crisis was preceded by the increasing political influences of neoliberalism, coupled with deregulation and privatization. This supported the increasingly high-risk, high-reward orientation of the banking sector. The deregulation led to an atmosphere of insufficient monitoring and regulation that encouraged intemperate speculation enabled by a web of favoritism. Thus, the bank ran businesses as there was no default risk, and in any case, banks would be insulated from default by the government. Next slide, please. Overconfidence in policymaking can be noted during the pre-crisis period, or the boom period as we call it, as seen in how Iceland was positioned as an ideal candidate for an international finance center. International Monetary Fund reports warned of the state of Icelandic banks in 2006 to 2008. But the Icelandic banking system did not respond by following suggestion to limit its size. Before the crisis, there were mixed opinions among experts between those advocating for more restriction because the banking system was characterized by high risk and vulnerability. Contrasted with those, and including there, was the central bank and financial supervisory authority that claimed the system was well prepared and stable. Furthermore, domestic media did not play a pivotal role in framing the crisis, but generally joined the game of encouraging the high-risk behavior of the financial sector that provoked the crisis. Dominant media narratives before the crisis echoed the euphoria of the boom years and valorized the wealth and success of bankers and the business sector. There was a political culture wherein decision makers downplayed the risks. The banks reoriented towards aggressive leverage mergers and acquisition. Incentive schemes led to grossly misreporting bank equity levels, leading to expansion of poor quality loan portfolios. The bank also facilitated the use of offshore tax havens among Icelandic financiers. A culture of high-risk behavior came to characterize the Icelandic financial and business environment in the lead up to the 2008 crisis. While egalitarianism and strong social relations are core cultural values, these were tested by the emergence of a super-rich class that emerged in the build-up to the crisis. Before the crisis, the Financial Supervisory Authority and Central Bank were largely passive and did not impose restriction on banks, despite forewarnings of the high risk within the banking sector. Those who were critical of the new order were often marginalized for expressing envy and a lack of foresight. As such, the high-risk activities of the banking sector took on symbolic importance beyond the economic impact. And then to the communication gaps. So next slide, please. In the response to the crisis, lack of transparency and communication, both among decision makers and between decision makers and the public and media, became salient. On September 29th, 2008, there was a public announcement of nationalizing the bank Glitnir as a way of communicating the emerging crisis to the public. This was the first step in admitting the crisis and the first concrete government response. The announcement was jointly made by both Glitnir, the bank, and the government. The key message was that nationalization would ensure the stability of the bank. Despite the announcement, the Icelandic krona, or the Icelandic currency, declined further, reflecting the growing distrust of markets for the Icelandic financial system. The public acknowledgement of the crisis shifted the communication context that decision makers operated within. This marks the point where the crisis cascaded from a private financial crisis to a public economic crisis through nationalization and public ownership in the banks. Soon after, or on the 6th of October, Prime Minister Geir Haarde gave a national television address about the crisis and need for regulatory measures by government. He narrated the crisis as a part of a broader international storm, referring to the unfolding global financial crisis. There was public admission that the banks were in trouble, but also calls for the public to show solidarity and optimism. During the peak crisis period, it became clear that communication and collaboration within the government was not working well, which created increasing pressure and contributed to poor decision-making. Communication was a major problem among decision makers and between decision makers and external audiences, including Icelandic media and the public, as well as international governments and experts. Inadequate information management, including a lack of media strategy, was a key shortcoming in managing the crisis. The sense that information and truth were withheld from the public amplified the public resentment, protest, and crisis of legitimacy for government. Next crisis, please. And then we are to public anger and political legitimacy. But in the wake of the banking collapse, protest became widespread and vocal. Public protest emerged in October, with first with a rally, approximately 1,000 people. The initial protest followed closely from Prime Minister Haarde's television address. The subsequent January 20th protest outside Parliament involved 2,000 people, with demands for the resignation of the Prime Minister. Protesters also objected to the use of terrorist legislation by the UK against Iceland to enable the freezing of bank assets. Collective action included frequent large protest rallies at the national legislature, where the loud banging of kitchenware earned the movement the name the Pots and Pans Revolution. This Pots and Pans Revolution escalated through January 2009. The protest focused primarily on government and political leadership. Most often, the first framing of crisis holds, but such was not the case in Iceland. While Prime Minister Haarde characterized it as a serious global crisis that was caused somewhere else and was therefore somewhat unavoidable, the public initial focus on the local causes of the crisis disrupted the government narrative. The crisis was re-narrated by the public and protesters as an expression of an underlying systemic crisis of legitimacy in the political system, with claims of corruption and elitist behavior. Protest framing emphasized that those who did not benefit from the financial bubble should not be punished for the mistakes of financial and governmental elites. This public counter-narrative framed the crisis as a crisis of political legitimacy made worse by decision-makers' action. In conflicts, issues may be connected to social themes to heighten participation. This was the case in Iceland, where protesters emphasized that core societal values such as justice and democracy needed to be protected. In the Icelandic case, public anger was an effective force for provoking a crisis of political legitimacy and subsequent reflexivity about governance failure and the need for reforms. Responding to demands for accountability and learning is important in recovery from crisis. The investigation commission appointed by the Althing or the Parliament was an important step in the learning processes. There were demands for prosecution and punishment of guilty individuals as part of the reconciliation process, and Iceland became the only country impacted by the 2008 global financial crisis to bring those responsible to criminal prosecution and punishment. Post-crisis, there has also been a focus on accountability and learning to evaluate and redesign institution policies and practices. The experience of the crisis resulted in tight government control over economic and market forces. A constitutional reform process was also launched, which used a highly participatory process of deliberation involving the public, bypassing political parties. As such, in the Icelandic case, we see how public anger and collective action led to the development of new formal arenas for more meaningful citizen participation as one outcome of the crisis, although constitutional reform is still ongoing. Here, we see how citizen mobilization helped channel the crisis recovery towards system renewal in the financial and political spheres. Over to you, Mark.
Great, thank you, Ásthildur. Let's see. All right, so what we're going to see now in comparison with the Newfoundland and Labrador case, we'll walk through some of the same dimensions that Ásthildur just talked about in relation to Iceland, but the details will look a bit different, even though many of the patterns are remarkably similar. So as with Iceland, context matters in this case as well. The crisis also appeared to be relatively sudden of Muskrat Falls and the bigger financial crisis. But when we think about Muskrat Falls in particular, the context that's important here includes what we might think of as kind of a deep story in Newfoundland and Labrador, drawing on the language of Arlie Hochschild, of kind of being cheated or taken advantage of on the previous hydroelectric developments on the upper Churchill River by Quebec and the federal government. Remembering that the Muskrat Falls project was planned during the optimism of the oil boom years in Newfoundland and Labrador. And also, a really important piece of the context is the Newfoundland and Labrador dynamics, where Labrador is often at more the periphery of the public imagination or political imagination of the province, and is often seen as kind of a resource hinterland region of the province. As in Iceland, there was a kind of a political culture of anti-reflexivity that reinforced kind of high-risk decision-making, overly optimistic orientations by both the government and by key agencies, including Nalcor. The project underwent review by the Public Utilities Board after public pressure, originally wasn't going to, as well as environmental assessment. And in both cases, the scope of review was relatively constrained, and the red flags that were raised early on through these review processes were largely kind of downplayed or ignored by decision makers. So the project was really kind of sanctioned. The mounting cost estimates were accepted, largely while ignoring some of those early red flags that were provided by those review processes. When the provincial Liberal government assumed power, they kind of inherited the project from a conservative government that had essentially planned it and commissioned it, sanctioned it, and they kind of pivoted a little bit discursively to kind of start focusing on it as too far along to reverse course. The second dimension, the kind of issue of transparency and communication gaps, here we can think of there being both kind of backstage communication gaps between decision makers and the provincial government and Nalcor, as well as front stage communication gaps between the province and the public and media. In the backstage, as Kelly Bladuc's research notes, there was a workplace culture within the civil service of focusing on the negative implications of information transparency, a kind of a risk avoidance approach to information transparency. And that organizational culture helped lead to communication failures and that kind of lack of transparency. There was also concerns raised throughout the lifespan of the project about Nalcor's unwillingness to share information, as well as the quality of information that was being shared with things like the environmental assessment review. In terms of front stage communication gaps, under the Williams government, a very charismatic leadership style of government, media access was often constrained where people were kind of critical of the premier government, which led to a certain tempering of oversight and critique. So there we also see the kind of both kind of front stage public communication gaps as well as backstage communication gaps among decision makers and agencies responsible for the project, the government and Nalcor, and so on. Third, we also see the way in which public anger emerges after the crisis becomes apparent, that kind of amplified a crisis of political legitimacy. However, I would be clear that here's where we probably see the biggest difference between Newfoundland and Labrador on one hand and Iceland on the other hand. Political reflexivity here was, the kind of public protest that emerged after the crisis was apparent. A lot of that was led by Labrador Indigenous community members and allies, such as the Grand River Keepers and Labrador land protectors, raising concerns about environmental health impacts, downstream impacts on traditional foods, and with methyl mercury and so on, as well as concerns about the stability of the North Spur, part of the construction, risks of potential landslides with downstream impacts. However, compared to the protests in Iceland, these were grassroots protests that tended to have much less kind of capacity and were less widespread. At the same time, there were also a group of kind of public intellectuals that were quite involved in St. John's, particularly focused more on issues of the kind of financial side of the project, the kind of financial the kind of governance, quality of governance from the financial side of the project. So while there was certainly public anger and attempts to provoke political reflexivity, attempts to push back against that narrative that the Liberal government kind of adopted of being too far along to push back, to draw back, or to turn back, these protests, we think, were more contained, had less political efficacy than we saw with the Icelandic case, where protests were much more widespread and ended up having much more political efficacy as a result. So with that quick overview in mind, to draw us towards a few different conclusions, the comparison does show us that Iceland largely did manage the crisis better, we would argue, that their responses led more in the direction of what Sylvia Walby calls a kind of system renewal response to coming out of crisis, to actually use a crisis as an opportunity for really reinvigorating economic or political systems. Once the crisis was acknowledged in Iceland, intervention was quite quick. That we wonder, we don't really have data that really says this per se, but that maybe the consensus-oriented political structure of Iceland might have been a very key factor here. But certainly we think maybe the strength of the protest movement was certainly a provocation to that quick intervention as well. External factors certainly also helped. The tourism boom that Iceland has experienced since about 2012 or so certainly also helped with the economic recovery. By contrast, the response to Muskrat Falls has largely been slower and is still unfolding as part of the kind of bigger financial crisis of Newfoundland and Labrador. And largely what we've seen with governments here seems to be more akin to what Walby calls a return to equilibrium response from crisis. So not really changing the structural rules of the game of mega project kind of governments or development, but just trying to get us back to normal. That said, it's still part of a still deepening crisis that's been magnified over the last few years by oil price declines and volatility. And we also note that, in particular, a key difference with Iceland is that here a lot of the protest was led by Indigenous community members as land protectors and their supporters, and it did have less political efficacy. And what that suggests is a need to strengthen respect for things like UNDRIP, so UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, or FPIC, free and prior and informed consent principles in the political sphere provincially, to kind of strengthen the oversight, the transparency, the accountability mechanisms that communities can turn to as a response to these types of crises in the future. We're also carrying out right now some survey data analysis that look at questions of financial sustainability as part of a broader kind of full spectrum sustainability. And we're really interested in how our participants' views of economic sustainability relate to other dimensions of sustainability, so environmental, social, cultural, the kind of the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and so on. And that's work that's still ongoing and will continue. But finally, just as our kind of main takeaway, we think comparing these two cases does give us some very valuable lessons about a political culture of anti-reflexivity and communication gaps and transparency issues that helped lead to these two crises, as well as teaching us lessons about how public anger can provoke a much needed, sometimes, crisis of political legitimacy and social learning amongst policymakers or decision makers. And we think if we can learn some of these lessons, we might be able to contribute towards more sustainable island futures. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark and Ásthildur. Now, just and I probably should have mentioned this before the talk, but there's going to be sort of two stages to the responses. I'm going to take the, I guess, the privilege of being the moderator to also be a discussant. And I've got a couple of questions just to lead, start the question and answer period. I'll remind you, and I know Maggie has put this up there in the chat, that you can, this is probably a great time now to submit your questions. And they can be either submitted through the chat feature there to everyone, or they can go directly to what is listed as Island Studies in the chat area there. So I know we're going to start building those questions up, and then we'll, as they come in and after this a short discussion period, then we'll open it up to questions that I'll moderate. So just to get it started here, just once again, thanks for the presentation. It's always great to be reminded both of what's taking place in Newfoundland and Iceland, and to me it's a fascinating sort of juxtaposition here of crises that are very different in nature, but seem to resonate with each other in a lot of different ways. I had the first question I had for you, and I'll leave it up to you to decide who wants to respond to this, is as follows. As both of you know, one of the goals of this broader project that this is a part of was to see if the differences in government and governance between a small island state, such as Iceland, and that presumably has a larger range of powers and independence and flexibility, and a subnational island jurisdiction, or what we might call a SNIJ, that shares a more limited range of powers because it operates within a federal system, made any difference in how they approached or worked through these crises. So based on your research, did the scope of powers in the two different places make a difference in what you found?
So maybe I'll start off with that, and Ásthildur, you can kick in if you have additional comments and thoughts. But I think there's kind of two answers to that, and I think one thing that we really see, I think, in this comparison is something that Levesque has pointed out about personalistic politics, and I think this idea that personalistic politics are kind of characteristic of small states, right? So the kind of very informal communication styles and interaction styles amongst decision makers, very close relationships between decision makers and their constituents. And I think we do see that personalistic politics is actually maybe part of what led to this culture of anti-reflexivity in both the small state setting and in the subnational jurisdiction setting, right? That I think following Levesque's arguments, I think we see that personalistic politics dimensions, the informal communication kind of stuff, that being characteristic of both settings. I think Newfoundland and Labrador, though, is interesting because I think federalism here has been a bit of a double-edged sword in the case of Muskrat Falls, where part of that kind of deep story that really helped promote the project was a kind of around an us and them between the province and the federal government, that kind of has a certain amount of political capital to kind of frame it as a kind of an us and them thing that helped justify the project. And also, I mean, the federal government helped with loan guarantees and all that kind of stuff that facilitated the project. But then at the same time, now that we're in crisis, the federal government can become kind of a resource to help with, managing the fallout, right? That would be almost impossible to imagine without the federal government in the picture. So I guess that would be the couple different ways I might answer that.
Yeah.
Ásthildur, do you have any comment on that?
I just think we should take the next, allow the next question. Okay.
Well, the next one I have is just to get the questions flowing here, is partly a reflection of the fact that I'm in an island studies program. And so whenever this is an island studies lecture, and so it seems natural for me to ask this next question. Do you think it made any difference whatsoever that these events played out primarily on small islands? And I recognize that Newfoundland is both a small island as well as got a mainland portion of it as well, rather than on a small mainland jurisdiction. In other words, do you feel that there's something about the culture of decision-making that takes place on islands that led to these particular outcomes? And maybe in the case of Iceland specifically, and maybe Ásthildur might want to comment on this, of course, the financial crisis that occurred in 2008 and 2009 played out in a lot of mainland jurisdictions as well. So did it make any difference that it was an island, and a small island, that may have had some influence in terms of how cultural decision makings or governance takes place, that it was on a small island as opposed to the equivalent jurisdiction on a mainland?
Well, in the case of Iceland, I think I would rather say that the smallness of the state played a part than the island factor, actually. Not so much the characteristics of a small state as having a limited administrative capacity, but more the informal processes and lack of planning that we can see, which is often the characteristics of small states. And as we conclude in our study that the informality of social interaction and communication is likely a contributing factor to the pre-crisis anti-reflexivity. So this informal and casual interaction between policymakers and the business leaders, and also the policymakers and the media, many of them as magically struck, we can say magically struck by the success of the financiers. This interaction or this communication led to kind of a harmonized chorus, inspired by over-optimism, overconfidence that overplayed critical voices. So I can say I would rather pull out the reason or the small state focus, as because, as you say, there were many countries in the mainland that were experiencing the same crisis. Although, of course, Iceland was the biggest casualty and the first one, but yeah, I would say.
Mark, did you have any comment on that from the rock?
I think I pretty much agreed. I think it was really about the small polity kind of the dynamics of informality of communication. The kind of the culture of like the oil boom and the boosterism that went with that during the time when the project was being planned and sanctioned. The kind of the very almost like cult of personality, like political culture around Danny Williams that maybe limited space for dissenting views and made it more challenging to express dissenting views. So I think I would very much agree with Ásthildur that it's kind of the small polity dynamics as much as it is about islandness.
I know we have people on in the discussion here that would love to sort of go off on a tangent in terms of the overlap in that Venn diagram between islandness and size, and whether it makes much difference, and how you disentangle those two potentially contributing features. So I'm going to have one last question here before we open it up, and I see we've got a couple of questions coming in here. So this is your chance to get your questions in, because right after this, I'm going to open it up to other questions that are coming in from other members of the audience here. And this last question really sort of takes off. I think that last comment by Ásthildur about the media is a good segue into this last question I have. One of your findings when I looked at the slide presentation seems to be that the role of public anger and I guess the mobilization of that public anger played in the actions that followed the crisis. And the differences in the ability of the media to contribute to that public reaction. maybe if I could ask one or both of you to go into a little bit more detail about the differences in the structure of the media, the public media or other media in Iceland versus the media in Newfoundland and Labrador that may have contributed to the difference in their ability to effectively either channel or build a protest in each of the two places?
Well, the strategy. I think in Iceland, it's not the structure of the media that played as much of a part as how media became actually part of the problem leading up to the crisis, how it had played the drums to the upbeat of the crisis rather than be a critical force and thus lost credibility. Because the media has actually shown, or media has played a pivotal role in many crises in Iceland, especially of course in response to the crisis, but has also been able to scrutinize societal weaknesses and thus been important to shed light on risk in society. The financial crisis became in a way also an internal crisis for the media. And and then you were asking about, Jim, also regarding the ability of the public or to protest through media, or
well, it's not really the ability, but I was curious as to whether, first of all, I guess it's almost two questions. One is the media structured differently in the two places?
Yeah.
And what role did the media in both places really contribute? Because based on my sort of read, and maybe Mark can chime in here, it didn't sound as though the media was as successful, if you want to call it, that's a very value-laden sort of term, in directing or channeling or creating public protest or anger in Newfoundland.
Yeah. I think we have to look at that, that the public actually created kind of their own media platform. That was what happened. Of course, by using social media to get out their messages, and of course they were able to get out the anger there, and last but not least, they were able to call on people to protest. And then we had this grassroots in defense group that actually created a special platform that was both to protest the IceSave crisis, and also it was a platform to for people to, well, you could go there and find everything that was written and even said about the crisis, and from international media, articles, scientific research, etc., etc. So we could say that in a way the public turned to another source than the traditional media.
Mark, did you have any final thoughts on that before I open it up to questions from the audience?
Yeah, sure. I think in the pre-crisis period, the more major kind of news outlets, the mainstream news outlets, were probably not being as critical, as kind of following along with the kind of culture of optimism of the time. Certainly, there was dissenting views and counter narratives of Muskrat Falls as we were heading into the crisis that tended to unfold more in alternative or independent media, like the Uncle Gnarly blog, so blogosphere kind of stuff, or the Independent news outlet for Newfoundland and Labrador. I think as the crisis unfolded, the Independent in particular became a very vital place for alternative information, but that wasn't necessarily picked up as much, I think, to the same degree in kind of more mainstream, widely diffuse media outlets. And I think as the crisis continued to unfold, there's been kind of two different kind of counter narratives. I think one focusing more on issues of kind of financial management, kind of economic risk, the kind of the project management side around the economics of it, that I think has been much more the focus for the most part in the kind of the urban center in St. John's, versus another counter narrative that's been much more articulated by downstream community members and supporters in Labrador around environmental risks and health risks of the project, and kind of health and safety issues. So I think maybe that's partly why things never, like the scale of public anger never got to be the same as in Iceland. We didn't have the same, kind of thousands of people on a regular basis outside the legislature demanding institutional structural change as a result of Muskrat Falls. And I think there's maybe, because those stories are kind of, the different counter narratives that were going, I don't know if it's as easy as just it's a media story or a lack of media attention. I think there's a whole bunch of factors at play. But I think it maybe is that, critical media attention came along a bit kind of really as the crisis was unfolding already, as it was becoming apparent, rather than kind of preventatively. And what counter narratives they were tended to be more constrained, right? And to more independent media, alternative media. So.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to the audience, and I'll remind the audience that there are no such things as bad questions. So I'm looking forward to seeing something. Before I turn it over, I just wanted to recognize that there are a couple other members of the Sustainable Island Futures team that are here. I see one who's from Le Reunion in Ireland in the Indian Ocean. Thank you for joining us at your hour, Maria Nick and Stratus in Lesvos, Greece as well. So I see we've got a couple of questions, and I apologize for turning my head 90 degrees because it's on another screen here, the questions coming up in Google Sheets. So if you don't mind seeing my left ear, I'm going to turn my head here and ask and pose a question. And this question comes from Pam Korestein, and Pam is in Mount Pearl in Newfoundland. And she asks, and I guess this is to you, Mark, do you think the arrest of Newfoundland journalist Justin Brake while he was covering the Muskrat Falls protest or occupancy affected the public's perception of the danger of protesting?
So on my part, that feels like a pretty speculative response that I'm going to have to give. Certainly, I think just the general kind of criminalization of protest, I think we'll always do that. We'll kind of have a chilling effect. And then I think like Justin Brake, certainly his process that he went through. So he was arrested for following. So for folks that don't know, I'll assume not everybody on the screen knows the story. He followed protesters in as they were committing civil disobedience at the Nalcor work site, and he was arrested alongside the protesters, even though he was there in his capacity as a journalist, covering the protest rather than as an active participant in civil disobedience. So I think certainly those kind of things can have a chilling effect, absolutely, on the quality of information, on people's willingness to engage. And I think that's, that might be part of what's going on. But I think, that's definitely a kind of over a pint of beer kind of maybe musing without a lot of data on my part, though. But I can definitely see that being a factor.
Well, nobody has ever accused academics of not musing over a pint of beer, Mark, so I appreciate that. The other question that I see here on the board, and this is also from Pam, and it's interesting because I, of course, given my professional baggage, approach these kinds of topics from a geographical or an island studies lens, but Pam, with her question, is approaching it from a historical lens. And so this other question that Pam asks is for really both of you. She asks, does the way each place was founded or established by Europeans continue to resonate down through time, affecting, for example, traditions of leadership and governance? Who wants to try to answer that question? Ásthildur, do you want to give a shot to see whether the establishment of, or the European traditions, either historically or even the ongoing sort of Eurocentric kind of traditions affect governance that takes place in Iceland even today?
Well, I think historically we are more kind of, first we are Nordic before we become European. So that's more our focus, that, well, it has kind of been, our origin is from Norway, and then of course to the British Islands. So I'm not ready to state anything about that. This is a typical European, and as you know, we are not a part of the EU, which shows a kind of a resistance, right? In the country, it has been brought up several times. So I don't feel comfortable about talking about the European heritage. But Mark, you take over.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think the first thing that place my mind immediately jumps would be more the Newfoundland and Labrador dynamics and the way that, and I think this I'm going to attribute this insight to my colleague Aaron Keeling here at Memorial. It's like he made these comments on presenting some of the stuff previously, but to me, but that Newfoundland and Labrador is quite unique because, as we know from island studies literatures, we're often talking about islands being hinterlands of mainlands, right? Especially for subnational island jurisdictions, where they're kind of places people move from, they're seen as resource hinterlands and so on. And that a lot of that is very true of the Newfoundland Island part of the province, but then it's a province where Labrador then serves a similar, which is a mainland part, kind of hinterland role relative to the capital in St. John's, kind of the kind of the center of political and economic power within the province. So it's a very, kind of another layer of separation with where this kind of mainland hinterland of an island that's also kind of a hinterland relative to Canada and Ottawa. So I think that, where we maybe see some of those kind of Eurocentric kind of governance, kind of baggage or traditions is, I think, really in that perception of Labrador primarily as a resource hinterland, that other than that rests very much at the periphery of the public imagination and the political culture of the province, until there is something like a Muskrat Falls crisis and the attendant protests that suddenly force Labrador into everybody's public consciousness all of a sudden. So I would see that, I guess that would be really where my mind would go with that question first and foremost. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark and Ásthildur. And believe it or not, we're getting close to the hour, and we want to stop at the top of the hour because we respect, or in the case of Newfoundland, the bottom of the hour, because we respect everybody's got a busy schedule. So why don't I'm going to turn it over for the last few minutes to Laurie Brinklow. But just before I do that, I just wanted to thank both our guests. I see we've still got about 20 some odd people online here. I appreciate the fact that you've tuned in when you've got many other things in your schedule, and the last thing you might want to do is another Zoom meeting, so I appreciate that. And I wanted to thank our two presenters today, Ásthildur and Mark, for your diligence, both in terms of your participation in the larger research project, as well as your the research. Just as fascinating to see this project evolve and take shape and see some of the outcomes. So it's great to see this work, and I appreciate the work you put in both for the project as well as for this presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laurie once again.
Thanks, Jim. And thanks, Ásthildur and Mark, as always, for having this conversation here with us this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. And even though we're gathering through a screen, I feel like it's been an engaging and enriching discussion about two of my favorite islands, and a wonderful testament to how we as islands and islanders are able to make valuable connections even when we're miles or oceans apart. Thanks to Brody for recording this session for Eastlink, and to Maggie for running things behind the scenes. And thank you to you, everyone, for sharing part of your day with us for this discussion. So if you've enjoyed this session, please be sure to connect with us on social media, like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Do whatever medias you do to keep in touch and stay in the loop about future events from here at the Institute of Island Studies, as well as from our colleagues and friends from around the world. We have a wonderful global island network that we often think of as families, so please feel free to join our family. As we've mentioned earlier, this session has been recorded for our YouTube channel, so keep an eye on our social media for the link in the coming days. And if there's someone you think would have loved to have been here today, please send along the link, and we'll be sure to tell you where the video can be found when it's up. So thanks again, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy, and looking forward to seeing you all again soon. Bye for now.